Excellent.
Okay. Hi, everyone. So I'm going to be presenting my current research on internet self-regulation in higher education and looking at a metacognitive approach to internet addiction. My name is Dean von Schoultz. My supervisors and co-authors are Kerry-Lynn, Thomson, and Johan von Niekerk. So before I get into this current study, this paper itself, I just wanted to give you a quick broad context of what I've been working on, what we've been working on, what we're trying to achieve. And what we're busy developing is a framework that leverages the network traffic that are typically found in academic institutions. And what we're wanting to do is leverage that in some meaningful way to help students specifically to have objective views of their web usage behavior so that they can manage their behavior a bit better. And what we found was that the network traffic, at least at Nelson Mandela University, there's plenty of very rich network data, and we can do a lot with it. I won't go into our previous work on that because, again, this is just a primer for context. And the overall framework that we're working towards is looking to actually present that data as benchmark comparisons to successful web usage, for students who are doing very well. That's still in process, but what this paper was looking at is how do we inform the actual intervention, the actual the interface itself in some meaningful way, because just interacting with your behavior is not enough, as you'll see. So this is what we were trying to achieve with this, is how do we get some more insight into actually presenting this data in a meaningful way. And the three kind of areas that form the background is internet addiction, obviously, and within a higher education context, and also specifically looking at why this behavior is problematic from a cybersecurity perspective, and that in attempting to avoid internet addiction or problematic internet use, intrinsically you're avoiding a risky cybersecurity behavior. So internet addiction, before I start, it's a bit of a misnomer, but it's a blanket term that is used for problematic internet use. So I might refer to it in a few ways, depending on what research I'm talking about. But it started around 1995 was when the academic community started to take note of it. And it started from Dr. Ivan Goldberg, in one of his psychology forums, made a remark about the rigidness of the DSM-4 and how it's over-pathologizing common behavior. And it was just a comment, it's meant to be hilarious, but it ended up mobilizing a lot of academic inquiry to it. And I won't go into too much depth about the literature because it's quite deep, even though it's fairly new. And what's at present, there's multiple perspectives on it. And the best way to think about how it's being perceived is more on a spectrum or a continuum, where at the end, there's these instances of people who go really deep down this kind of this route of internet use that involves characteristics that are very similar to substance abuse and have been kind of juxtaposed with actual substance abuse and chemical abuse, in that they have the behavior is there's versions of tolerance and withdrawal and cravings and real problematic behavior and loss of control. And one of the big questions, well, what is it about the internet that becomes so addictive? And one of the models in 2001, Davis created a model which is called the cognitive behavior model, and he made a distinction between generalized and problematic, generalized and specific, what he calls pathological internet use. And that's quite helpful, in that general pathological internet use refers to typical emails, communicative type of features, whereas other specific pathological internet use was very specific features that are unique to the internet that people have been found to get hooked on. I use that term very loosely, and that is internet gaming disorder, internet sex addiction, and online gambling addiction. And these are kind of evolving as we go. And as far as clinical recognition, recently, the internet gaming disorder has been flagged as one that warrants further research into inclusion in the DSM. But there's still a long way to go. Again, there's too many perspectives on it to actually nail it down, because the internet to support that there is real addictive properties and behaviors that are being found. In the context of higher education, the reason why we're interested in it is that throughout the internet addiction literature, university students have been flagged as high risk, and a few suggestions have been made for this. It's not too difficult to see why, but there's a lack of parental coercion. You're expected to self-regulate. You're in a most likely in a new environment where you need to establish new relationships. They've been also found to be fairly susceptible to loneliness and depression, which are very clear precursors to internet addiction and problematic internet use. And the 18 to 25 threshold in the psychological literature has been shown to be fairly ripe for addictive behavior to emerge. So undergrad populations are definitely more susceptible than others to this. And what's also interesting is there's been a slate of neuroimaging studies through functional magnetic resonance imaging who have actually scanned the brains of people suffering from internet addiction. And what they found was the prefrontal cortex had experienced significant functional and structural changes. And that's the part of the brain that's responsible for metacognition, like self-control, impulse and compulsive behavior, and decision towards goals. And recently, a series of studies by Hadlington, they made some very clear correlations between internet addiction and risky cybersecurity behavior, as well as impulsivity and risky cybersecurity behavior. And I can't remember the author of the other one, but media multitasking has also been associated with that as well, which I'm sure a lot of you have, through other studies, have found. So what we're trying to do in this study is just look to the literature to see, has there been previous work that is doing what we're trying to do, and what we can pull from that. And the secondary objectives was to, what can we find, or what can we derive from literature to inform the design of the intervention to make it actually, effective and easy to engage with. So the results that we found about nine useful studies. We couldn't find any research that was doing exactly what we're doing, explicitly the way we're doing it, and nothing really close to that. So the only findings we can derive was for the secondary objective, and basically trying to figure out how can we inform our intervention in a meaningful way. And out of these 9, there were 4 studies which we could really take some interesting findings from and consider when we develop the prototype. So I'm going to speak about these 4 studies in some depth so that you can see how we're interpreting the findings and how we're going to use that. The first one was by Wu in 2015. And they were looking at classifying undergraduate students based on their meta-attention traits. And this is quite interesting, but their main assertion was that students are in this environment called a personal learning environment. They're expected to receive course material and to engage with online material and collaborate. And they're specifically focused on that because there are a few pedagogical models that are advocating the use of social media and certain online features alongside the course material, which is kind of fairly intuitive. And so this idea of increased engagement is alongside your actual learning processes online, it's not going anywhere. And that requires a constant need for self-regulation. There's also this need to, or this idea of Baumeister, his ego depletion theory, saying that you only have so much self-control within a day. And depending on certain levels, you're constantly having to use that. So they adapted the metacognition theories. So they were saying essentially that metacognition is very important for the learning process, but unless you can focus in an online environment, those learning processes will never happen. So they adapted the metacognition frameworks to apply to meta-attention to measure these undergraduates' meta-attention profiles and do some cluster analysis on that. And the framework they came up with was basically split into knowledge of attention and regulation of attention, and operationalized as perceived attention discontinuity, social media notification. I will give you some examples of this so that you can understand what they're actually measuring there. Then regulation of attention, which is what kind of behavioral strategies or mental strategies do students use to manage their attention? And just to give you some examples of how they measured these, they used a Likert scale with agree or disagree. So perceived attention discontinuity is essentially how aware am I of my engagement issues? And, you know, the item was something, one of the examples of the item was, I often turn on my computer for studying, but find myself doing irrelevant things. Social media notifications, I'm constantly looking out for, you know, how aware or how much am I anticipating these notifications, and how can I manage that? And the behavioral and mental strategies are just internal strategies of handling or setting up an environment from a behavioral perspective, logging off certain things, etc., or mental strategies, setting up incentives, internal reward systems, things like that. So they measured these, and they did a cluster analysis, and what they found was five meta-attention profiles. And they're characterized specifically by these different knowledge of attention and regulation of attention traits. And the motivated strategic was, they scored highest on regulation of attention scores. And, you know, very little awareness of engagement or actual existence of engagement problems. The unaware had very low levels of regulation of attention, as well as the perception or presence of engagement issues. The hanging on, they clearly experienced some engagement issues, but they had some regulatory strategies that were kind of mitigating that to some degree. The non-responsive were very aware of their engagement issues, but they didn't really have the means to avoid that, or to prevent that from being an issue. The self-disciplined, they had very low knowledge of attention engagement problems, but they had some degree of regulatory strategies already. So these are the profiles, and alongside these measures, they also looked at a couple other variables like internet usage variables and final grades, which is what we're really interested in. And what this meant is the motivated strategic, the self-disciplined, and the hanging on kind of ended up in the top half of as far as success for that online course. And that's incredibly relevant because all three of those profiles had some degree of regulation of attention strategies. And so this correlation is fairly important. What is also interesting is that the internet use, so these are search behaviors or search strategies, and this is internet self-efficacy. Those didn't correlate. Those were fairly well spread out across the profiles. What that means is the regulation of attention, those mental strategies and behavior strategies are the key. And the internet use or, you know, internet self-efficacy traits didn't have such a major impact. So this is quite consistent. You know, there was this disconnect between knowledge of attention and regulation of attention, and this is quite this is consistent with personal informatics literature, in that a lot of the interventions who took this approach of, okay, here's your behavior, go and change it, the awareness alone was not enough. There needs to be some indication, again, some practical application or some training of sorts to actually implement these strategies. So the implications for our intervention is that we're considering some form of pre-screening to identify these students who have low regulatory strategies, and they will benefit a lot more from certain features of an intervention, which specifically are looking at training these mental and behavior strategies. So it's a fairly important finding, and we're definitely looking forward to including that and testing it further. So the second and third study were actually a single line of inquiry. So I'm going to look at them together because the first study just kind of tested if it was possible, and then they followed up with a couple extra ones. So Dunbar, Prov, and Roberts, they looked at using Fishbach's dual representational model of goal-directed behavior, which has been previously used in marketing and sales. And basically what the model asserts is that at any given point, an individual has the regulation or their goals framed in a certain way, and that affects a few things behaviorally. And the two frames are the commitment frame and the progress frame. And basically, if you're in a commitment frame, you're not necessarily concerned about progress because you haven't committed to that goal yet. So you're not sure if you're actually you've actually committed to that goal. Whereas a progress frame means that you've already committed and now you're interested in progress. So sorry, just got a message there. Let's see if I've got. Okay, so what they did was they primed a group of students to, they gave them a vignette about internet addiction so that they would prime their goal as to reduce internet use, their personal internet use, to avoid problematic internet use and problematic, or to avoid internet addiction. So their temptations or their incongruent goals were personal internet use and their congruent goals were academic. I'll just speed up a bit here because I might be going a bit off. So essentially, what they found was that if the students were in a progress frame and they received negative feedback, they noticed the difference in their progress, and they were more likely to perform congruent behavior. So they valued behavior that was against their goals a lot less. They wanted to bridge that gap. But when they received positive feedback, they thought, okay, well, I've done enough for today, or I've done enough for now, and they would value other behaviors more. The opposite was true for students in a commitment frame, and they took that positive feedback as insurance. Okay, look, this is possible. Let me commit a little bit more to this goal because clearly it's possible. But if they get negative feedback, they say, well, I don't even know if this is an option for me because I'm not making much progress, etc. So the response to the feedback was very much tied to the type of frame that they were in. What this means for our intervention is the order and format of the information is incredibly important, and because it affects your behavioral value system. So what they also found were there's a few ways to prime these frames. The one was representing actions as complementary or conflicting. The other one was through use of basic questions. The other one was through the use of abstract and concrete goals. And the other one was increasing engagement levels. And what our takeaway from this was also informed by a productivity management study called Time Aware. And what they have found is that increasing engagement, they needed to frame the feedback for it negatively, because as soon as it was positive, the engagement with the application fell off. So it's likely that we'd want to adopt a similar approach, and therefore, before showing this negative feedback, which will enhance engagement, the user of the system needs to be in a progress frame so that they actually value their congruent behavior more highly, because that's what they found in this series of studies. So and of these ways of priming a progress framework, the concrete goals is most likely what we'll use, because in previous self-regulatory system management, or in theories on self-regulation, the setting of goals, specifically concrete goals, is a lot more desirable. It's more practical. So that really did help us inform that aspect of this prototype. So that was also very interesting. The last study was done by Lebar in 2019, and there was a fairly straightforward correlation analysis. And what they looked at, this idea of time perspectives, and that's essentially how do you perceive time and what is your view on that, and that affects certain traits. And what they were looking at is what is the correlation between a person's time perspective and multitasking and internet addiction. And there's the 5 basic categories: past negative, past positive. So past positive, fairly optimistic; past negative, very pessimistic; present fatalistic; and present hedonistic. Fatalistic
so this is a 1-minute reminder.
Okay, thank you. So I'll jump ahead, but essentially you can liken them to personality traits. And what they found was there was a positive relationship, first of all, which was it was found in previous literature, between internet addiction and multitasking. And of those time perspectives, the future was the future time perspective tended to mitigate internet addiction and multitasking, which characterized by conscientiousness and delaying of gratification. And past negative, which is also been associated with loneliness and depression, was found to positively correlate with internet addiction as well as multitasking. So this particular study doesn't translate very well directly into an intervention design. They assert that time perspective training is what's necessary, but how malleable your time perspective is unknown to us right now. So that's part of the future research. So just to recap, I'll go through this real quickly. So these findings, basically, we are interested in pre-screening for meta-attention traits as well as time perspective traits, and using that to leverage certain features, and that when receiving positive or negative feedback, the user should be in a certain in the corresponding self-regulatory frame. So I'll just kind of run through these real quickly, but essentially, there are a couple other ways we're going.
So I really think we should keep the times here. So you're over with a couple of minutes now. So
I'll go straight to questions. There you go.
Thank you so much.